When the King of England who preceded William died without any children, William said that he had been promised the throne because he was a playmate. I mean, he and the king grew up together. He was a playmate of the king, and he said he'd been promised the throne. And when he wasn't given the throne, when another man was given the throne, the man who was given the throne, Harold, did not have any what you call blue blood in his veins. Harold, therefore, had no right to the throne because he was not blue-blooded. William said he did have a right to the throne, so William collected an army. Now, William was the Duke of Normandy. Normandy was a duchy in northern France. William collected an army of a lot of Frenchmen and adventurers and anybody he could get, and went to England and defeated the English king, King Harold by name, and took the throne. And he helped England have a strong centralized monarchy, which was something the other European countries did not have. Strong. Now, during the Middle Ages, most of the kings in Europe were rather weak. That's why it's called a feudal system. England was something of an exception. He had a strong army. Now, keep this in mind, folks, because this is going to affect English and French politics for the next 500 years. William the Conqueror was a vassal to the King of France. I mean, he was Duke of Normandy. Which meant the English kings held a vast amount of territory with the French. Now, William, being King of England, did not in any way consider himself inferior, but he was a vassal to the French king, nevertheless, at least in the affairs of France. And this was to lead to all kinds of problems between England and France. The wars between England and France were actually to last off and on for the next 800 years. They finally ended it with when Napoleon was defeated in 1850. Then England and France made peace, and they've been together to this day. All right, now, let me tell you, what I'm about to say will not be on a test, but there is something that's more of a personal note for me about William the Conqueror. One of the men he carried with him to conquer England was a man named Warnibald. Again, don't write this down. Warnibald, as a reward for his services to William, when William won, Warnibald was given a territory in Scotland, and this territory eventually became the county of Cunningham. The people living there had the surname of Cunningham, so Warnibald took the surname of Cunningham himself. He married a woman named Cunningham, and his descendants would be the earls of the Cunningham County until 1802, when the last male heir died without any heirs, and the earldom became dormant. They had never made it legal to pass the title on through a woman, where the earldom might still exist to this day. But the Earls of Glencairn were to figure highly in Scottish politics for the next 700 or so years. Again, from just a personal note, the earldom of Cunningham includes the town of Paisley, where my great-great-grandfather came from Paisley. Do I think I'm descended from Warnibald? Probably, because every Scotsman alive today is probably descended from every Scotsman who was alive and had any children who lived around the year 1000. I mean, after all, you have 2 parents, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 5, 12, 10, 24, all your ancestors. And after a while, after 30 generations, you wind up having more than 1 million descendants, unless some of them are the same lines. You follow logic: 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on. So I'm probably descended from him, but I can't document it, can't prove it. Anyway, just some little personal note there I thought I'd throw in. The next king of any consequence, now we're skipping all these kings, but the next one is Henry II. I mention him because, for one thing, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine. But his big contribution was he strengthened the royal courts. He strengthened the royal courts And that meant the local courts and the church courts were weakened. He established a common law throughout all of England. In other words, before his time, each little locality had its own laws. Well, he realized that England needed a uniform law system, so he established a common law throughout all of England. Now, he tried to rein in the church, but he was not successful. He said that clerics who misbehaved should be tried in state courts. The church said no, clerics should only be tried in church courts. Well, he had a fairly long and drawn-out fight with the church, in which, due to an unfortunate circumstance, he lost. Now, if you visit England, there in this London, in the main church of London, anyway, you'll find a statue to Thomas Becket. Here's the thing about what I've gathered about Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was a worldly man and didn't seem to have much interest in church. So one day, William Henry II made him Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, the highest church official in all of England. In other words, the king made a churchman out of it, thinking this worldly-minded man I can control, he'll do what I want. Now, folks, a lot of presidents who've appointed judges to the Supreme Court have found out that once you put these men in office, you can never tell how they're going to act. Just ask Dwight Eisenhower if he were alive and say, hey, what happens to, he said, I made two appointments to the Supreme Court that I wish I hadn't made. Earl Warren and Brendan Manning, we're about those names. But anyway, when the king made Thomas Becket a churchman, all of a sudden Thomas Becket became what the king had made him. He became a churchman. He might say he not only dressed like a churchman, but he walked and talked like a churchman, but worst of all for the king, he began to think like a churchman, and he took the church's side on every issue, hard against the king. And even a pope wrote him a letter saying, Mr. Becket, we don't want to have to create a scene between your king and us, tone things down. Becket didn't even listen to the Pope. He continued. Well, one day, the king was sitting at his table and someone sent a message and Thomas Becket opposed him again. The king was sitting at his table and looked around the table. I mean, these kings of this line had a quick temper. He said, all you dogs who sit around my table, eat my table, can't any one of you take care of this man for me? Big, bad mistake. 4 knights got up to the table with their swords, went to see Thomas Becket. They had a little altercation with him. Thomas Becket refused to back down. He was to become a martyr. These knights hacked his head to pieces. This actually was a serious blow to Henry, because all of a sudden Henry found himself at odds with everyone. Thomas Becket goes down in history as a martyr for his cause. The king had to do penance for his rash deed, and the king basically lost his fight with the church. He had to appoint another archbishop, but he realized with a bad mark he had made against Thomas Becket, there was nothing he could do to rein in the church. The church continued to have their own courts, to have their own public lands. Now, I want to say this about public lands. A lot of persons, to assure themselves a happy afterlife, the wealthy would give their lands, or give a big portion of lands to the church, instead of giving it to the children. Now, folk, I disagree with this totally, because what happened was after a few generations, the church had almost all the good land. I mean, this man, he gave his portion of his land to the church, then his son would give a portion of his land. After a few generations, the church got all the land, the children had none. And the state felt like it was time to take some of these lands back, and this became a big controversy throughout several places in Europe. I'll say this about inheritance. Personally, I believe in leaving inheritance to the children, not in some organization. I mean, hey, it's no sacrifice if you give something to an organization after you're gone. If you want to give to an organization, give while you're alive, and then leave the inheritance to the children. If you've raised them up the right way, they will keep contributing to that organization. Yeah, I see at least one head nodding, but give the inheritance to children. Well, basically, the church wound up with all the land. Henry II tried to take some of this land back, but again, he lost his fight with the church. A real setback for him. And King Henry had to succumb to popular opinion. Now, Henry had 4 sons, as I mentioned, by his wife Eleanor. He actually had a bunch of other sons who wouldn't count because they were illegitimate. But the next one after him was King Richard. I'm not going to write his name down. I've mentioned Richard, though. Richard spent 9 of his 10 years outside of England fighting in the Crusades, trying to take the city of Jerusalem back. He could not. He opposed Saladin, the most able ruler that Islam ever had, or one of the more able rulers Islam had. And make long story short, Henry failed to take back the church lands. But the next king, though, we do him is John. Now you notice I don't have a number 2 or number 1 beside John's name. That is why the royal family has not named any of its children John in 800 years. Now if there is ever another king named John, they'll call this one John the First and the new one John the Second. But King John goes down in history as the worst king England ever had. He was prone to throw vile fits of temper, prone to outrages. I mean, he would just roll around on the floor and scream and holler and yelp. I mean, he had a worse temper than his father did. He would kill people for no good reason. But like his father, he had a lot of land in France, and one day he made a trip to France. While he was away in France, the nobility got together and said they didn't try to depose him, because that would have there would have been people who opposed to that. Instead, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta goes down in history as one of the greatest documents of freedom ever established. What it did was it told the king, yes, you still are king, you can still be king. We're not going to take from you the right to be king, but here are things that you may not do as king. You know, your power is to be limited. When King John saw that every nobleman in his kingdom was against him, he signed. Now, partly as a result of this was like England's first official attempt to limit the power of his kings. John's descendants still sit on the throne of England today. They may have no power, no authority, but Queen Elizabeth II is a descendant of King John. All of the kings after him were his descendants, with no exceptions. You might say Oliver Cromwell, but he never took the power. He never took the title of king. But the ones who had the title of king were all descended from him. Unlike France, who today doesn't even acknowledge it has a king. And the same thing can be said for Germany and Russia. England still has its king, and again, owing to the fact that the English told their kings, beginning with John, there are certain things you may not do. Now, the next king of any importance, I mean, there were several I'm leaving out, but the next one I will consider is Edward I. He was a lot better man than King John was. He was a grandson of John. He was the one who convened the first Parliament. Now, maybe it seems like I'm throwing a lot at you, but folks, this has become important. The reason he convened the Parliament was he needed money, and he wanted to convince the nobles that he needed money, so he thought, hey, I can get more money from them if I can get them to agree to the tax that it must impose. So he called together the higher nobles in London to meet, and they called this the Parliament, and it's only the nobles that first met. Now later, of course, the commoners were to meet, and eventually the commoners would take over. But Parliament eventually became the governing body of England. When I was a kid, I learned in the United States we have Congress. In England, they have Parliament, which serves a lot of the same function. But he convened the first Parliament. The purpose was to raise taxes, and eventually kings of England learned that they could not give out, they could not raise a tax without the consent of Parliament. The king had to convince Parliament that the king needed the money. And later on, a whole lot of kings would get themselves deep into debt, but they couldn't raise a tax to pay off their debts, and because they couldn't convince Parliament they needed the money to pay off a lot of their personal debts. And some of the kings got pretty deep in debt, particularly King Charles II. And to pay off his debt, he gave a big sum of land to William Penn, who's founded the colony of Pennsylvania. But that's later. All right. Parliament was to grow in power over the centuries, and in fact, Edward I's son, he had a son named Edward II. Edward II was so worthless that Parliament voted him out of office and put his Edward II's son on the throne. So Parliament was asserting its power rather quickly after Edward convened it, when they told Edward II, after 20 years of rule, incompetent, inept rule. I mean, Edward II would buddy around with drunken buddies and hang around with their own crowd and commit all kinds of various atrocities. He was also a drunk, and he lost Scotland, among other his misdeeds. He lost Scotland for them. And after 20 years of his rule, Parliament said enough. They forced him to retire and put Edward II's son on the throne. All right, so much for England for right now. Again, their main kings, King William, King Henry, King John, and King Edward, 4 kings, all of which led the way to eventually making England into a very great country. Small, yes, but still one of the strongest countries of Europe. To this day, they have kept their kings, they've kept their nobilities, they still have their dukes, they still have their counts, still have their earls, but their nobles have no authority. They have a House of Lords in Parliament, but it cannot make any laws or even approve of laws anymore. All the laws are made by the House of Commons, but they still have the House of Lords. France. In the land of France, when the last Carolingian died, and again, these kings had problems in that they would oftentimes inbreed. They would marry cousins to try to keep what they thought was better blood in a line, and really that was a huge mistake. But they would marry, and their children oftentimes be weak of body and mind, feeble-minded, feeble-bodied. The last Carolingian died young without any heirs, so the nobles of France got together, and they made a weakling to be king named Hugh Capet. And he founded the Capetian dynasty. Now we've talked about 3 dynasties that France had: the Merovingian, the Carolingian, and now the Capetian. Merovingian. They died out. The Carolingian. Anyway, then finally the Capetian, founded by Hugh Capet. The Capetians were very weak at first. The first 6 Capetian kings amounted to nothing and did nothing. Then finally you got one who amounted to something. The first Capetian king who we could really call strong was Philip Augustus. Philip Augustus. He wound up taking over, among other things, Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He conquered these duchies, some of the more powerful duchies. And money began to figure in the European economy, and I don't know if anybody knows where the gold and silver came from, but gold and silver have been lost here in late Roman times. But some of that gold and silver might have come up from Africa, and money became part of Europe's economy again, so he was able to draw in more revenue than the other kings, and that helped. Like King Henry of England, he increased the power of the royal courts. And again, these kings would use war, purchase, outright buying, or marriage alliances to increase their power. Now, we're going to remember to talk about him later. He participated in the Third Crusade. He went on the same crusade that Richard did in England. But he quickly abandoned the crusade. I don't know for sure why, but he started on the crusade, turned around and went back. Everybody thought, hey, this crusade would be great because King Richard is involved, King Philip of France, and with his powerful army. But and also the Holy Roman Emperor was involved. Well, the Holy Roman Emperor drowned. Philip turned back. And that left Richard of England to fight for him by himself against Saladin, and Richard was no match for Saladin. Now, I always tell this story when I come to Philip Augustus. Philip Augustus was the son of King Louis VII, and you may recall, I told you last time, Louis VII had married Eleanor, and Eleanor had never borne him a male heir. So finally, Louis divorced Eleanor and married another woman who bore him a son. So he was the only son of his father. He was quite a bit younger than his father was by this time. Well, anyway, when Philip was about 16, he decided to go on a hunting trip alone. I mean, he was royalty, so he had to lose to hunt. And on his trip, a farmer stopped and said, "Hey, sire, there's the shoe on your horse is coming loose. One of your shoes, there's a nail loose on a horse." The young prince, being young and still foolish, thought, "I'll stop for a nail. It's not worth it." So the prince said, "Keep the nail, my good man. You might use it for something someday. You'll find some use for it. Just keep it." And the prince rode on into the woods with one of his horses missing a nail on his horseshoe. And it became a saying that was popular down through the age. Because of the nail, the shoe was lost. Because of the shoe, the horse was lost. Because of the horse, the prince was lost. Make long story short, another nail on that same horse's foot worked its way loose. And after a short while, the horse's shoe came off. And any of you know anything about horses, when the shoe came off, that meant the horse was tenderfoot. The poor horse could not walk, could not carry the prince at all. The prince had to dismount. And then it was found out the horse did not know his way back home, which was bad enough because the horse was apparently in pain. The prince got very sick. Eventually, though, the prince and the horse were able to wander back to the farmer who had found the nail in the first place. The farmer was able to get the shoe back onto the horse with the nail he'd saved. Again, save a nail, battle horse. And folk, every time I think about throwing a nail out, an old, went up rusty nail, I think of that save a nail, battle horse. Someday, I often wind up throwing it out. I mean, want to save the rusty nail that's worthless. But, I'll take a crooked nail and take a hammer and bend it back straight again and try pounding it. But sometimes the same reason it bent the first time, it's going to bend again and get pounded again. So, not important. But anyway, the prince found his way back to the farmer. The farmer got the horse back on his shoe, and then the farmer used the horse to send word to the king. Hey, "King, your son is here at my farm, and he's very sick." When the king received that news, the old king was just beside himself with worry. So the king wound up going to the priest and asked the priest, "What can I do to make my son well?" The priest said, "Go visit the tomb of Thomas Becket. Go a pilgrimage, and never mind that Thomas Becket lived in the realm of your enemy Henry." So the king went to visit Thomas Becket, crossed the English Channel, and the king met King Louis VII met Henry, but by this time Louis and Henry were no longer in the mood to fight each other, especially Louis VII. Make long story short, the prince did recover, became well. Then these Capetian kings, one after another, they had a habit of crowning their sons while they were still alive. Well, sometimes this is a big mistake anyway. Shortly afterwards, King Philip, who was about 17, was crowned by his father, well, not he would be, his father, Louis VII, had been crowned king. And sometimes, folks, this is a big mistake. Louis VII's health began to decline drastically after he crowned his son. Don't ask me why they, hey, I'm trying to tell you something about retirement. My father retired on July 31st, and he died on August 11th. 11 days after he retired, he died. Bear Bryant retired from coaching football 1 month, and he died the next. That word retirement can be dangerous to your bodies. Your body just goes into shutdown. Yes?
We reported that were he actually sick or something?
He died of a heart attack. He had his first heart attack 1 month before his 58th birthday. And then he had a second one, and oftentimes the second one's fatal. He had the second one 11 days after retiring. Now, I know he was not sick. He was recovered from his first heart attack, or thought he was. And then he had a second 11 days after retired. Again, we do not know perhaps if he had continued working or found something. It's okay to change careers. I mean, I'm retired from hockey, but I haven't quit working. What would happen to me if I quit work? I'd just sit around the house and probably in short order I'd be gone. I don't know that for sure, but it's likely, unless I found something to keep my interest up. Anyway, the old king went out shortly after he crowned his son, and Philip Augustus got the throne at 18. And like I say, he became one of the best kings England ever had. After this foolish incident I talked about, he apparently became wiser after that. All right, the next king we're going to mention, and I want you to keep him in mind as we talk about this, King Philip le Beau, or Philip the Fair. And this word fair in this case means handsome. It doesn't mean just. He was called Philip the Beau, or Philip the Fair, handsome. Now, what he did, he was copying the kings of England. To collect taxes, he instituted the Estates General. Now, the problem with the Estates General was the French kings eventually became so powerful that they said, I can levy a tax without the Estates General. And the Estates General did not initially wind up becoming powerful. Now, if you study French history, go on to the French Revolution in the late 1700s, the Estates General wound up chopping Louis XVI's head off, him and his wife Marie Antoinette. Any of you familiar with this story? Louis XVI and his wife had their heads chopped off by the Estates General. But the Estates General never became really powerful, but the idea was to get the nobility to agree to set up taxes. He set up council groups to be his assistants, and he realized he could not govern by himself, so he appointed special favorites of his to be his assistants. And under him, France became the wealthiest and best-run kingdom in Europe. Now, I told you I'd mention Philip again. When we come to the Crusades, I will. Philip was the one who ordered the execution of the Knights Templar. Now, I want to ask, how many of you have ever heard of the Templars? Okay, about 2 or 3 of you, yeah. They're still around. In fact, at Lockheed, I worked with one, and yeah, he knew the story. And essentially, the Templars became very powerful in Europe. Philip became suspicious of power, and Philip got together with the Pope and had him executed. That's a story I'm going to tell later in the semester. But keep him in mind because we're going to run into that name again. All right, moving on from France to the Holy Roman Empire. The first king after Charlemagne to become powerful was Otto. Now, I told you how that Charlemagne was crowned emperor, and that they set up this title, Holy Roman Empire. It was neither holy nor an empire. It basically governed the German states, but Germany remained independent to hold there are actually about 100 independent little German states, and supposedly the Holy Roman Emperor was ruler over them. Under Otto, though, the Holy Roman Empire got involved in the affairs of Italy, and for the next 600 or 700 years, Germany and Italy were to engage in all kinds of wars as the German emperors tried to assert their control over Italy. And as the Italians resisted them, there was no real union between these people. And it's ironic because as these two countries were getting together in World War II and try to take over the world, but they had a different culture. The Germans generally were hardworking. I'm not saying the Italians weren't, but a lot of times the Italians were more interested in leisure and play than the Germans were. The Germans and Italians were not necessarily alike. But both Germany and Italy were to remain disunited until 1870, and a lot of the problem was this office Holy Roman Empire. And finally, in 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte was to abolish the title entirely. But Otto is one of the kings. Now, another one of them, after Otto, the more famous one was Henry IV. Henry got involved in a controversy with the Pope. Again, that's not unusual because so many of them did. As Pope and King fought each other for control. The issue here, of course, the issue was church lands. But another issue is who is to appoint church officers? Who appoints the bishops? The king says, I do. The Pope said, I do. And they had a controversy over this. Now, eventually, anyway, what happened was Henry lost his fight with the Pope. Now, folks, you may not realize, maybe none of you seem to care, what difference does it make who appoints the bishops? And a lot of persons I've noticed in my classes, a lot of young people are indifferent to religion. But folks, this to me is an extremely important fight because where it wound up ending with was Europe wound up with church and state being separate. The church wound up being able to appoint its own officials. You might say, why is that important? Well, I don't know, except I'm convinced it is. Because this way the church became an independent body and not a tool of the state. Now, in contrast, in the Islamic world, there is no separation between church and state. Church and state are one. In the Byzantine Empire, the emperor appointed all the church officials, with the result that the church became nothing more than a puppet, a tool of the state. In Europe, the church, at first the church controlled the state. I mean, I've already mentioned how these kings would take on the church and lose. Well, maybe that wasn't good. But at least when the smoke had cleared, the church was independent, the church was a church, the state was a state. The church appoints its own officials, and to this day in Europe, when the Pope dies or resigns, no king, no ruler, no parliament appoints the Pope. The church appoints its own Pope. And in turn, the Pope appoints all the cardinals, most of the bishops, all the archbishops. And then the cardinals appoint most of the local priests. You know, basically the church appoints its own people. Why is this important? Well, it means that the church and state are separate entities. The church can sometimes speak up against the state, and sometimes does. Because then it means that the church somewhat holds the state in check. Now in Russia, for instance, where that the Tsar appointed all the church officials, the church never one time protested anything the Tsar did. And when the communists took over, Lenin and Stalin in turn appointed the church officials, because after all, that's what the Tsar had always done. And during the 70 years that communists ruled Russia, the church never, ever one time protested any action by the communist government. While the communists killed 15 million people by starvation, when there was plenty of food to go around, the church sat back and said not a word. I'm talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia. So, folks, this may seem like what's the big deal? It was a big deal. Henry did not take over the church, was not able to appoint church officials. Today we can look back on it and say, well, in this case, the church was right. The next emperor of significance was King Frederick I. Now, folks, when I was in graduate school, I mean, I used to read biographies of these men. I'd go to the big library at the University of Tennessee and check out books. And one of the books I read was a book about Frederick I. I've already mentioned how that he went on a crusade with Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted. and lost. Anyway, Frederick I was Holy Roman Emperor, but instead of caring about Germany, he spent most of his time trying to govern Italy. A big mistake that they all made, and the result was the Germans didn't like him because he faced toward Italy too much. The Italians didn't like him because he was a foreigner. He was opposed by the Pope. The Italians would not submit to German rulers. And the German kings would go down to Italy with their armies to try to conquer Italy and unite it. Even though, hey, forget the fact that Germany is not united either. The German kings always lost. And oftentimes they lose their whole armies fighting in Italy. Eventually, Frederick, your book doesn't mention this, but I remember from reading the biography more than 40 years ago, Frederick had a plan for Europe where he was going to unite all of Christendom under himself, and he called his plan the Great Design. He was going to be Europe's greatest king, the ruler of all of Europe, and he felt like he had to conquer Italy first. And I'd like to go back in time and say, hey, worry about Germany. That's where if you can get Germany united, then the rest of Europe might fall to you. But forget about Italy. You're not going to get it, and it wouldn't be of any help to you if you did. I mean, quite frankly. But anyway, he was the first one to call his empire the Holy Roman Emperor. These others were actually Holy Roman Emperors, but he was the first person to actually use the title. He called his plan the Holy Empire, and he was going to reunite the Roman Empire. Another attempt to bring Europe under one rule again. It failed. His nephew was also named Frederick II. Frederick II goes down as being a very brilliant ruler, a man ahead of his time. Both by today's standards we call him liberal. He was somewhat of a liberal. And folk, I'll say this about the liberals. They think that they're more intelligent than the rest of us. In some cases they are. I want to give you an example though. In England, just before World War II, England had a really brilliant prime minister named Neville Chamberlain. And Neville Chamberlain negotiated a treaty. I mean, that's what liberals like to negotiate a treaty of peace with Adolf Hitler. And he got off an airplane waving this piece of paper. With this, I have guaranteed peace in our time. Within 3 days after he got off the plane, Hitler broke the treaty by invading Poland. The people of England kicked out Neville Chamberlain and appointed Winston Churchill, a man whose IQ was noticeably below the IQ of Neville Chamberlain. So sometimes brilliance is a handicap. Hey, I want to tell you a story that happened at Lockheed. One of the engineers there, I mean, don't ask me why this engineer couldn't figure it out, but one of the engineers bought a flashlight that wasn't working. So these engineers, I mean, these were Lockheed engineers who were actually too smart to do what they were called. They were called on to find out why the flashlight doesn't work. Well, they got out their voltmeter. First thing they did was measure the voltage on the battery. Yeah, they had to pump volt. Then they measured, well, now let's check for continuity. Does the voltage get to the switch? Yeah, okay, voltage got the switch. Now, when we turn the switch on, does voltage get to the other side? Yeah, well, does voltage get to the socket? So they measured the voltage. Yeah, the voltage gets to the socket. Then they realized when they measured the continuity across this light bulb, the light bulb was burned out. I watched this actually happen. Now, anyone with half of an IQ would have simply replaced the bulb to begin with, or replaced the battery, rather than go through all that hassle of checking for continuity from battery to bulb, and finally, maybe the thing is it burned in the bulb. But, I mean, this is what happens when you get people, they ask people to do something they're too smart to do. But anyway, Frederick was a brilliant man, and he was a loser. Unlike his uncle, Frederick I, he was an Italian. So he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Now these emperors, the church made sure that they never passed between the church and the electors. They never passed it from father to son. So Frederick tried to unite Italy, and tried to unite Germany, just like Frederick I had done. But it failed. The Holy Roman Emperor had no power in either Italy or Germany. And as a result, Germany and Italy could not unite. Now, Frederick tried to negotiate with the Muslims for control of the Holy Land and actually got Jerusalem back for 10 years. But then the treaty was broken. But he actually negotiated the treaty rather than fight a crusade. Frederick is also remembered for something else, an experiment he tried. He wanted to figure out, now, what would humans speak, what language do humans speak if nobody talks to them? You know, so he picked 50 orphan babies, and he told the nurses, you may not talk to them. I want to see what kind of speech they develop. Now, folk, there have been many such experiments tried, and keep this in mind if you become a parent. All 50 of the babies died. And the results have been the same every time this experiment has been tried. The point I'm making is human beings cannot invent their own language. And didn't to begin with.
Why would they die?
Language is a legacy.
Why would they die just because they've been taught?
That is an extremely good question. Apparently, all right, here's the thing. The babies, I think, understand more than they are capable of expressing. And they know when they're being talked to. Basically, they know they're connecting with the person, whether it be the mother, the father, or a relative, or a nurse. They know they're connecting with the person who's talking to them. Take that power, take that speech away from them. They live in a silent world. They feel completely rejected, and they lose their will to live. Now, we don't know what goes on inside their minds, but we do know that in every case where this experiment has been tried. Now, I mean, there have been instances out where that human babies have been picked up by wolves and raised up as pharaohs. At least the wolves will at least try somehow to communicate with them. And this has been documented and proven, particularly in the case of Romulus and Remus. And for American folklore, Pecosville was reared up by wolves. But this has been documented and proven. Wolves can sometimes rear up human babies. But to take a child, baby, and never talk to them is a surefire way to kill them. Again, you can check it out yourself. Frederick tried to experiment. These kings would try all kinds of experiments. Peter the Great, for instance, tried to raise a race of giants by getting the tallest people in the realm. What he did not know was that sometimes height is based on bad pituitaries and not on heredity. But he would breed a tall man with a tall woman, think he would produce a tall offspring. Not necessarily. If both of them had problems with pituitary glands, the offspring would not necessarily be tall. And he sometimes found out that he could rear up short, he'd get tall parents and rear up short people, short children, or sometimes vice versa. Sometimes really tall children come from short parents. It can happen. It depends on what combination of genes you get. All right. Anyway, Frederick, one day he made a huge mistake. He took the top nobility while his army was fighting. He decided, I'm going to take the day off. He took the top nobility, went on a hunting trip. They went into the deep woods. When he got back, before he could see the camp, he could smell smoke. This was his concern. When he got to the camp, he found his entire army had been obliterated and all his supplies set on fire. His army was all dead. And even his admirers have to condemn him. Because basically, without all the top officers gone, when the enemy attacked, there was no one to call the men into formation, no one in charge, no one to set the battle in array. If Frederick had been there, the battle might have had a different outcome, because the army that attacked him was actually smaller than his own army. But again, the army lacked organization, because he was not there. And he never recovered from that loss. His entire army gone, he never recovered, and he died, by all accounts, a failure. My history book in college called him a brilliant failure. All right, moving on. Slavic people. We get the word slave from the word Slav. These were people who had come in from Central Asia, the Bulgars, the Magyars, the Huns, and they all lumped together in Europe to the people we call Slavs. And eventually these people assimilated. Now, I want to say this about the Slavs. Adolf Hitler looked down on them as being inferior, and he said these were among people who should be eliminated. And he had saw nothing wrong with going in and taking over Slavic lands. And one day he invaded Russia, which is primarily a Slavic country itself. And you may all know the story. He lost in Russia. But anyway, the lands I'm talking about are Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. They did not embrace Eastern Orthodox Christianity, became Roman Catholic. And well, the ones of them in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia became primarily Roman Catholic. The ones in the Greece, Macedonia, they became primarily Eastern Orthodox Catholic. And keep this in mind, Serbia also, which is northwest of the Balkans, became Eastern Orthodox Catholic. And that's why they had such affinity with Russia. The reason this is important was to lead to World War I. When Austria tried to crush Serbia, Russia moved in, and all of Europe practically all of Europe wound up getting involved in a war. Now, the Eastern Slavic people encountered the Vikings, and they called these Vikings the Rus. And from this we get the word Russia, which takes us up to the next. This will be the last of the countries I'll talk about in Europe, folk, I promise you. Then we get to other aspects of the story. But the Rus, or the Russians. Initially, Russia was governed from the city of Kiev. Not Moscow, but Kiev. And they eventually embraced Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Here's one reason why. One of the emperors named Vladimir married the daughter of the married the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. So Vladimir married the Byzantine emperor's daughter. And the Byzantines, of course, were Eastern Orthodox, so he married the Byzantine's daughter. And he embraced Orthodoxy. Now, there's a little bit more to the story than that. The story is that Vladimir became dissatisfied with the religion of his Norse ancestors, the worship of Thor and Odin and Frigga and Tyr and these old gods. And he realized that all of Europe was turning against these old gods. So he said to himself, I wonder which religion I should embrace. So he checked out 4 religions: Islam, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Judaism. Well, now this is his view, not mine. He rejected Judaism because any God who's not strong enough to keep his own people in their homeland was not strong enough for him. So he rejected Judaism. He rejected Islam because Islam forbade him to drink. And folk, I've had more than one person say amen to this. Anyone who knows anything about the Russians know they drink a lot. No, Islam forbids drinking. No, I can't have that. So, yeah, this is in the records, folks. Well, so Islam went out the window. Also, Islam forbade gambling and a few other things that he liked doing. Well, he next looked toward Roman Catholicism, and the problem with that is that, no, Roman Catholicism insists that I bow down to the Pope and submit to the Pope in Rome. I can't do that. So out the window went home. Then, last of all, he went to an Eastern Orthodox church, and there with a stained glass, and he said, the choir sounded like it came from heaven. They said it was like I entered into another world. And he embraced Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, why is this important? Because Eastern Orthodox became the official religion of Russia from Vladimir's day until 1917. And Eastern Orthodoxy is still very strong in Russia. Now, unfortunately, Vladimir appointed all the church officials, and the Russian church became a tool of the state. And with the results, I think, are very bad. This did not happen in the West. But the problem with the Orthodox, and this is something Vladimir did not appreciate, was Orthodoxy did not separate church from state. And somehow, folk, don't ask me all the details why, but somehow or another, it seemed like separation of church and state is extremely important. Eastern Orthodoxy did not do so. Yes, and Roman Catholicism did. Now, I'm not pushing religion, but folk, I'm just trying to be open and neutral about this. I want to say that about the Eastern Orthodox. I had a friend at Lockheed who converted from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy. He said the same thing. He went to an Eastern Orthodox church and said it felt like he's in another world. The choir, Sons of Heavenly, and the stained glass made you think you were in heaven already. And he wound up becoming an Orthodox priest. But then before it was over, he said, if I'd have known what I know now, I wouldn't have done it. Here's what I said to him to begin with. When he first made his move, here's the problem I have with Eastern Orthodoxy. Everywhere they have been, either the Muslims have taken over or the communists. Well, yeah, I know that, but then maybe it's because they were just closer to the Islamic world than Rome was. That may be true. The fact of the matter is, folks, I mean, I'm not pushing religion, but I'm stating facts here. It's just a fact. Understand? Everywhere where the Eastern Orthodox have been, no exceptions that I know of, either the communists have taken over or the Muslims first, the communists second. Hardly any exceptions. Now, eventually, the capital moved to Moscow, and here's how. The Mongolians took over Russia, and the Mongolians held Russia for 200 years. And one of Russia's biggest contributions to Western civilization was they served. I mean, if you look on the map, Russia takes up a third of Europe, if not more, almost half of Europe. Russia served as a buffer between Mongolia and the rest of Europe, and somewhat kept. But anyway, the Mongolians took Russia, held it for some 200 years. But during that time, something very unusual happened. In the city of Moscow, they called it Muscovy, they had a 200-year period in which they only had 5 noblemen ruling. Only 5 in 200 years. You might say, how's that? Each one of these 5 lived to be an old man, and when he died, he turned the throne over to a middle-aged son. And when that son lived to be an old man, he died and turned the throne over to a middle-aged son. Basically, they had only mature rulers for 200 years, and during those 200 years, the people of Russia deserted Kiev and began to look to Moscow for leadership. And Moscow was the group, the Dukes of Moscow, who became the Russian Tsars. Moscow is the group who finally drove the Mongolians out. Now, we have a clause in our Constitution that has never been questioned, never been changed, that says our president shall be at least 35 years old, and our vice president. Again, it's never been questioned. All our presidents, actually I think they've all been at least 40, because we think that any person younger than that is not mature enough to take on the head of government. Now, I'm talking to a class. I know most of you are under 35, but let me tell you something. You wake up tomorrow morning and you'll be past 35. You'll get there soon enough. Anyway, we have that clause in the Constitution. It was based a lot on it. We found that when a place has more mature rulers, it generally is run better. The older people get more respect, so on and so forth. But they had 5 rulers during a 200-year period. That means each of them ruled for an average of 40 years. Russia finally drove out the Mongolians. Russia was to spend its time, if you read Russian history, they never could decide whether they were Eastern or Western. One of their czars, Peter the Great, tried to direct their attention to the West, said the West is where the area is climbing. But if you had been a Russian during most of its history, it seemed like the East was ahead of the West. And where was Russia? Mostly behind. Russia has spent most of its time far behind and trying to catch up. Always behind and trying to catch up, and this has been true in my lifetime. However, fast forward to 2015, and our best and biggest fighter, the F-35, is grounded because it doesn't work. And folks, I just read an article 2 or 3 days ago that the Russians have their fighter aircraft all working. If that doesn't scare you, unless you're Russian, it should. Basically, the Russians might have caught up and passed us up. Yes?
Why isn't Russia like trying to?
Why haven't they come and tried to take over us?
Yeah, because we're not really allies. Like, yeah, people travel there and whatnot.
I'm glad you asked, because there's one good reason throughout my lifetime. I mean, when I was a youngster, we all thought, as recent as 1980, I had my teacher at Lockheed, I took some classes at Lockheed, the teacher asked the same question. Here's why. A lot of it was bluff. They had 3 times the submarines we did, 4 times the missiles we did, twice as many fighter aircraft, but their equipment did not work. Their equipment did not work as well. Our equipment was better than theirs. I mean, you buy a tank from Russia, I mean, this is what the Egyptian president, Nasser, once said. Buy a tank from Russia, you can't get it to work. Buy a tank from the United States, and it works right away. Their equipment did not work. You know, they knew, it was bluff. They knew that if they fought us, they'd lose. Now, that was yesterday. Today, folk, today,
But doesn't Russia make so much money off of people traveling to Russia? Like,
Oh, they're getting money
I've
off of it.
always had people from Russia coming in. And
they were poor, but they're now getting some money. All right, even though now, let me explain. The Russian ruble has declined in value because of the embargoes we've imposed on them. And they also, the average Russian does not have the same lifestyle that the average American does. But then again, a lot of American lifestyle is based on debt. We don't own our cars, the finance company owns them. We don't own our houses, the finance company owns them. I mean, I've done the same thing myself. Debt. But they get some money also from other sources, oil among other things. What's that? Natural oil and natural gas. Russia has the second most natural resources in the world, with Africa being the first. Africa is still number one and Russia number two. They have a lot of natural resources, but, and they've had some problems too, but I'm not sure anymore. I mean, at one time, I was pretty certain the United States could whip them because our equipment were weak. We can put out better products than they could. I mean, a tank, well, a bulldozer made under capitalism will be better than a bulldozer made under communism. Because a capitalistic company, right, if we put out a shoddy bulldozer, we're going out of business. An automobile made under capitalism is better than an automobile made under communism. However, the Russians have somewhat modified the communistic stance, and their equipment is now better than it once was. All right. Anybody else? I mean, I'm glad somebody woke up and talked about Russia because
Do you think it's coming?
What's that?
Do you think that like Russia would ever have would ever just come to like United States soil and try to start a war here? Or do you think a war would ever start here?
I wanted to say this about the war with Russia. You may not know. I read an article recently. You can shake your head no if you want to, but an article that the war is actually already going on, even though it's not erupted a shooting war. But the war is now being fought over the Ukraine or the Crimea. Because Khrushchev gave it to the Ukraine, and it's a war. And it's a war in which the Russians are moving in and taking over the Crimea. And the rest of the world is just uttering voices of protest, but not doing anything about it. And the Russians are quietly moving in. We know that they're sending in troops, and they're actually shooting at the Ukrainians and winning. And the United States is sitting back doing nothing. The war is already begun. That's one way of looking at it.
I thought they ceased fire.
Well, temporarily, yes. But guess what? The Russians still own the Crimea. Yes.
Yeah, but I think the world of them learned the lesson from World War II. So even though they're in the world along Russia some leeway,
Yeah.
I don't think they'll be able to overpower them if everybody come together.
Yeah, but Russia and China are what the two biggest countries
Two
in
big
the world, two
countries.
biggest
They get
armies.
together.
If they get together, we're
Here's the thing. If the Islamic world, the Russian world, and the Chinese world get together, they're bigger than
And
we.
we owe China so much money. The only why wouldn't they come and try to like take our land?
That would be
That
the
is
main
a
reason
really-
why they won't go to war with us.
Because we owe, they want our
China
money.
never go to war
They
with
want our
us
money.
because
Yeah.
we owe them too much.
But again, folks, if they get together, I don't think we have the means to. I mean, now, of course, I thought that when I was a child, because Russia seemed the biggest. But again, they didn't try to attack us because they knew their equipment was not as good as ours. Anyway,
If the United States and Russia fought, the world would be, Russia got more nuclear bombs than us. But it doesn't take half our bombs and half of their bombs to destroy the world. They'll sit there and boast and argue, and the United States will use sanctions to attack their economy, simply because they make most of their money from oil.
yeah.
They're not they just, most of their money comes from oil. But if the United States and Russia fall, the world will end. It's mutual assured destruction. nobody's going there.
That's what Khrushchev was afraid of, for one thing.
Yeah.
Khrushchev was a premier when I was a kid. We worried about that even when I was a kid, because the atomic bomb was invented in 1945, and with help from American scientists, among them people like the Rosenbergs, the Russians stole our secrets from us and built the nuke by copying. Some of you have heard the Rosenbergs would send the nuclear secrets inside a pumpkin. They'd cut open the pumpkin, hollow it out, glue it in such a way it could not easily be detected, and ship the pumpkins over to Russia. But the Russians knew which pumpkin to look for, which pumpkin to open up, and inside would be nuclear secrets. The Rosenbergs were executed for treason. And I had students do papers on that in my second semester class. They copied us to get the nuclear bomb. They were the second nation after, the first nation after us to get it, the second nation to get it. Then England figured it out, France. Today, well, we don't even know how many nations know how to make one. It's still a big issue. Is Iran going to be next? All right. Now, one thing we'll leave Russia. Now, folk, again, this is what I'm about to say is making news. The High Middle Ages. Then I'll close. The period I'm talking about is a period from 1000s, 1100s, and 1200s, known as the High Middle Ages. It was a prosperous time. It was a time when Moorish serfs were able to buy their freedom. It was a time when people in Europe began to move from country to city, which we know city is necessary for urbanization, for commercialization, for factories and all this. The population doubled within 300 years. Between 1000 and 1300, the population doubled. People were happier, more settled, and more peaceful. Their farming produced a lot. Iron, a lot of the iron, we believe, may have come from Africa again. But iron was used. Now, what made the High Middle Ages so great? Essentially, folk, in one word, the High Middle Ages had a climate that was as hot as a firecracker. How do we know this? Because crops that would not grow today in certain latitudes would grow then. It was during this time that the Vikings crossed the Atlantic and settled in Iceland. But they also settled in an area called Greenland. Now, history books will say, oh, let's name it Greenland so that the people will be attracted. No, the fact is, in those days, Greenland was actually a very green land. And the Vikings who moved there lived in Greenland the same way they lived in Norway and farmed the same way. And the Eskimos, the Vikings looked on the Eskimos being demons, wouldn't have anything to do with them. The Eskimos had a lean time during this hot time. Then folk came to cool down. The cool down in the year 1307 when the climate cooled. And a big plague swept over Europe called the Black Death, and it carried away 1/3 of the population. What caused the plague, among other things? The climate cooled down. But, now again, this is making news this morning. Our present president, whom I make it a point to not talk about, he's now in the Everglades promoting legislation to lay off a bunch of workers on the grounds that we must not emit carbon into the air because the carbon will create global warming. We must not have global warming. Now, folks, I don't like to talk about the present, but because, I'm afraid I might get in my car and what I said not be as true as I said it was. But nevertheless, I'm pretty certain we're on firm ground with this. The High Middle Ages was high because it was hot. And when the Vikings went to Nova Scotia, they found a certain type of grape. From their description, we know that this grape today will grow no farther north than the state of New Jersey, but it grew all the way up in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. In other words, those places farther north. When the cooling came, all of a sudden Europeans would find they would plant the crops and a big frost hit. Well, they plant their crops again. And this time, before the crops were harvested, another frost. And the growing season was shorter. They starved because they could not grow as the same crops they'd grown for generations. Again, folk, if you can prove me wrong, do so. But the harder things are, the better it is for life. Cool things down, and life becomes less abundant. Try proving me wrong if you can, but folk, I want to remind you, there was a time when all the earth had a uniform tropical climate, even the polar regions, there was no ice cap. Even Antarctica, the continent way down under, had a tropical climate, year-round tropical climate, no winter. And life on Earth was super abundant, yes.
So then we could survive if, like, the ice caps melted.
Yeah.
And it's global warming.
Believe me, we'd be better. Here's why. The deserts would turn, all right, some of the land would go underwater, but the deserts would turn into flowering, blooming paradises. We would have more land. The people living on the shoreline of Florida would have to move, but we would have a whole lot more land than we have now.
Maybe we should start selling global warming insurance. Do they make that?
Well, but now, yeah.
For like Cali and Florida residents?
Now, I want to remind you of something else. You can ask your physics teacher. If you have a bucket of water and there's a chunk of ice floating in that bucket, now the ice is floating. I mean, I don't mean it's touching, but it's floating. And the ice melts, what will it do to the level of the bucket?
It'll raise the water.
Wrong. The level of water will remain the same. In other words, what I'm getting at is if all the ice in the North Polar region melts, it will not raise because this ice is mostly floating. Now, Antarctica is another matter. What's that?
What happened to the polar bears?
Polar bears, they're related to grizzly bears. They find ways to adapt.
Oh, okay.
I mean, yeah, they can move, but they find ways to adapt. Now, hey, every time the climate changes, some species, nature has eliminated 95%
Well,
of the
natural
species.
selection, huh?
Natural